Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and thank you so much for joining us here at the Chau Chak Wing Museum. Those honoured guests who are in the room with us right now and many other people around Sydney and elsewhere in Australia are joining us as part of the seminar or webinar tonight as well. My name is Craig Barker. I'm the Head of Public Engagement, and it's a great privilege to welcome you to the first official public program in the Chau Chak Wing Museum. It's been a long time coming and we are so very excited. Before I introduce our speakers tonight and explain the format, it is incumbent on me to acknowledge the fact that the University of Sydney and the Chau Chak Wing Museum are on lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The University of Sydney and the Chau Chak Wing Museum pays our respect to traditional owners, and we acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. The Chau Chak Wing Museum is Sydney's newest cultural asset. It combines the collections of the Nicholson Museum, the Macleay Museum and the university's significant art holdings. And in coming months, in a series of hybrid events like this, in front of a live audience and online, we will mark the collections, we will mark some of the remarkable researchers and collectors who have worked with those collections over time, some of the remarkable stories as to how these treasures came to be at the University of Sydney, and we will talk a bit about the history and the future of those collections. But tonight, for our very first public program, we decided that we wanted to pause to mark this remarkable building that we are in. We opened to the public yesterday, and the thousands of visitors who have streamed through already have been glowing in their love and admiration for the building, you'll be pleased to know. We've been very, very excited. And so tonight marks a celebration of the achievement of inception, design, construction, and now use of this particular space for celebrating cultural history. Our presenters tonight, our guests tonight, are the architects Kiong, Lee and Graeme, both from the Sydney-based design studio Johnson Pilton Walker, JPW, a firm with major building works in architecture, planning, urban design, landscape architecture, and in broader design in both Australia and internationally. JPW have received more than 100 national and international design awards within the last decade. Kiong Lee is an award-winning project director with JPW since 2003, widely regarded for his innovative approaches. He's led the JPW team on a number of projects, including the UNSW Asia Science and Engineering building in Singapore, and also 363 George Street and Westpac Place. Graeme has been with JPW for more than a decade, and he's led projects including the Westpac Place and the Australian Museum's Collection and Research Building, the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra. In 2013, Graeme completed the master plan for the West Australian Museum and is currently assisting the Art Gallery of New South Wales with the Sydney Moderns project, and has also worked on the Australian Museum redesign as well. So in terms of cultural heritage and cultural design and architecture, there are perhaps no two finer people to speak to us about how the Chau Chak Wing Museum fits into the broader picture of museum design and contextualisation within the 21st century. This evening, Graeme is going to give a short presentation about the Chau Chak Wing Museum, and then both Graeme and Kiong will take some questions moderated by Madeleine Borthwick, who's very kindly joined us. Madeleine is one of the Chau Chak Wing Museum's greatest supporters, and we really thank her, not just for tonight, but a lot of things you've done for us over the past few years. Madeleine is a lecturer in design at the School of Architecture, Design and Planning here at the University of Sydney. So, Graeme, if I could invite you up here. Ladies and gentlemen, Graeme Dix.
Thank you for those kind words and introduction, Craig. Good evening, everyone, and it is a wonderful thing to be able to invite you into this building. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we're meeting and where this building stands, and where our practice is situated as well, the Gadigal people of the Ora Nation, and pay our respects, Kiong and I, and our practice, to their elders past, present and emerging. We started this project in 2015 through a series of interviews and submissions as part of a competitive process, having been invited by the university to make a submission. When we received the information at the start, it was couched around or framed around some material that David Ellis, the director, had prepared. And you couldn't ask for a more inspiring brief than something like this. A place where ideas, culture, experience of place intersect and create new ways of thinking about the world in which we live and our cultures around the world. So it was absolutely fantastic to start on this journey to be selected for this project. We were, however, quite lucky to get the job, I think, because when we arrived for the interview, we didn't bring anything. So when the person who was running the show for the second stage interview said, would you like to put on your presentation now? We said we didn't have one. We thought we were just coming for a quiet chat to see where the project might lead to. So it was all a little bit awkward for a moment. But we managed to strike up a conversation with the people in the room, some of which are here tonight. And we found many parallels and interests that we could evolve into ideas that would make sense both for this place, for the museum, the university, and the city more broadly. So that was really, really exciting. And probably the most important thing we did at that interview was just listen. And that's what I think good architects can do. They can listen, they can interpret, they can challenge, but they can listen. And so our ability to try and understand the aspirations of the university and the museum within it and how that could peg into the wider world was something that we really enjoyed. And I think we would congratulate all the museum staff and team who have worked with us to try and do that. It's not something that architecture does. It's what the process of design through architecture and exhibitions can actually create. So really, really inspired. The other perhaps surprising thing for some people, and I hope I don't upset Scott too much with this little interlude, but we were actually invited to build a building on a different site. A great site, the site of the Macleay Museum, one of the first purpose-built museum buildings, well, it was the first purpose-built museum building in Australia. We made some suggestions in our submission about how you might start to explore expanding a very sensitive heritage building on a very, very constrained site. And it was a wonderful building. It didn't exist currently like this. It's been progressively filled in, but it had the character of an amazing space, an amazing place, which could still work very well as a contemporary museum. And it's surrounded by some really interesting external spaces that exist along Science Road that create a series of outdoor rooms, which we thought we could evolve. But it has a very aggressive side to the northern side on Parramatta Road, thousands of cars passing there every day. So while the landscape is really interesting, the site is very, very challenging. And those huge trees present all sorts of complications for the way you might put a building there. So to try and start a conversation about the sorts of ideas that could be explored on a site like this, or any site for that matter, we prepared a series of slides, and I've taken just a few, to try and promote conversation about what could a 21st century museum be about? What should its identity be? What might it do differently between day and night? How might it express a contemporary relevance that goes beyond just the collections it has and looks to the future? How could it work at the ground level and activate spaces inside and out and be a living place throughout the day and into the evening? How could it deal with different types of exhibitions and types of spaces that we know 21st century museums will need, yet other types of exhibitions, and you will have seen from walking around the building already, the sorts of very intimate spaces that are quite different in their character and their ability to present material. We talked at length about how we could capture the landscape and use that as an asset for the building that could do all sorts of things, that could be a programmable part of the place, just like the spaces inside. We wanted the building to be connected to landscape, like my favourite museum, the Louisiana one in Denmark, an extraordinary connection between place and purpose, which we really love. How could we capture vistas? By this building, by Tada Ando in Japan, creates again a series of outdoor rooms which work marvellously. How do we create a building where the circulation is so legible and understandable across multiple levels that it's easy for everyone to navigate around? This building solves it very simply because it's just a circle, but it also has other aspects of its character which are really, really interesting for architects and I think for curators to work with, which are the sorts of things we want to draw out with people. And it too is surrounded by a different series of landscape spaces, which we think are really interesting and worthwhile trying to embed in the sorts of thinking we're doing here. We talked at length too about what sort of exhibition spaces should the building contain. Are they small and densely populated? Are they broad and highly flexible? What should the balance be? These are all things that a brief can't necessarily tell you at first glance. It needs to be evolved as part of a conversation. And I think, again, that's where we found so much insight from the museums team, which really made it easy for us to start working up ideas. We needed to understand how long people might stay there, where they would need to take a break, where could you provide them with some respite. And perhaps most importantly of all, we needed to understand who the audience was going to be. What should their experience be? From very young children to very elderly children, what can they do with this place? How can they use it? That's really what we wanted to work through. Then we had to go on a journey ourselves to understand what the museum and the university's collections were really about. What sort of spaces were they grappling with already? And how should all the good things, how could they be translated through to the new building, and all the things that were just wanted to be discarded could be left behind. And then understanding the collections, and this would warrant a talk of several hours just on its own. Being led through the collections by Marie was just extraordinary. The diversity of objects, of material, of cultural material was just mind-blowing. And I think, if anything, we're so happy that this project has enabled those intersections of collections to work so well across so many parts of the building. So we tried to apply some of the cultural experience we brought to the project, and also exchange ideas about things that we had learned that were very successful across our project. So the portrait gallery was one about circulation, very easy place to navigate around, but only on one level, so quite different to where we ended up. We wanted to understand how a building could exert a particular presence, like the Anzac Memorial in Hyde Park, which has a very clear structural diagram, which helps you again understand the place and the connectivity between its site, the existing building, and the new work. And we wanted to make sure that that was legible for everybody. So you don't have to be an architect to appreciate these things. Anyone can enjoy good architecture through engaging with it in the way that it connects with its purpose. The work that we've done over many years with the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and finding ways to make places more inviting, to work longer hours like this building is at the moment, to really understand how people expect their cultural infrastructure in cities to work most effectively. That's what we wanted this building to do. We brought a level of exhibition expertise, which Richard Johnson, one of our founding directors, has, to bear upon the way we might organise spaces. What proportions should they be? How might they be connected? How should you be able to circulate through them? And all the back of house stuff, which everyone forgets, but which is fundamentally important to making a building like this work for the longer term. So we were able to bring and share experience from other projects like the Art Gallery Storage Building, which means that buildings like this can work efficiently into the long term. Other projects we talked about again with back of house spaces, collections and research building, which looked at how you could organise conservation and the like. So a lot of work went into understanding the place. What are the vistas? What are the spaces? How can we connect those places into the broader context of the museum? And also understanding the building. How are you going to engage with an existing building in a sensitive but contemporary way and make sense of it all in the bigger picture? A lot of work went into trying to understand area too, because the museum had a very clear brief in terms of area outcome it required, because a lot of work over many years by the team had been done to develop solutions for predicted exhibition programs, which they were absolutely certain they needed to do. So we developed a proposal that we thought started to achieve all of those things very successfully, which had a very strong identity on Parramatta Road, but created a series of spaces internally, which made the existing building flourish. Unfortunately, in some respects, but perhaps not too many. This is a picture of Daniel on the left-hand side, the project architect at the time, realising that this thing was going to cost about $3 million to move, and it was in the Macleay building. So that made everyone take a bit of a step back and rethink what we could do next. And that's where the proposition to explore a building that could exist on the tennis courts at the time came to bear. So we had to do some work very quickly to try and understand what might be possible, mindful that everyone was very sensitive to this site, right at the university's front door, directly opposite the Great Hall, and really forming a pair of buildings as a gateway into the campus from Parramatta Road. So really, really important site. So over a couple of days, this was prepared so that the Building and Estates Committee could consider the opportunity to move the site. So this work was prepared, and that really became the springing point for where we got to now. So we still had this incredibly inspiring brief and interesting project, but now there were a whole lot of different pressures coming to bear on it that we needed to work through. It was, or it is, an extraordinary site. The fact that it has such important neighbours, such a wonderful outlook to the city, and at the end of the avenue and the pedestrian way that links so many different parts of the universities together, and those trees. You can't get 100-year-old trees. They are such a powerful presence on the site. The other thing that we really liked was that it was also part of the civic infrastructure of the city and the university, which other people could share. So it did feel like a very public part of the campus, and that's something that we wanted to really accentuate. So the first thing we had to do was prove to many different stakeholders and interest groups whether it was possible and appropriate to put a building there. So a lot of work was done to understand the evolution of the place. And there were, in fact, many previous master plans, like this one by Walter Burley Griffin early last century, which had proposed significant buildings on and around this site. And this is partly to do with the university's land holding, which was different back then, but there were other people too. So the government architect, when there was only one government architect for Australia, George McRae, he had also proposed a significant building directly opposite the Great Hall. And you can see over time how these trees on the side of Parramatta Road become stronger and stronger and stronger. Even up to the 60s, buildings of different types were still being proposed on that site. So it certainly wasn't a sacred space in terms of building a building there, but it was clearly a very sensitive site. And from the 60s, you can see the Fisher Library is being constructed and the tennis courts are existing there. And even as late as 2008, there were master plans thinking about how you could put a substantial building on that site. So there's certainly a lot of work done to sustain that argument. And it is a wonderful avenue of trees that connects Victoria Park through to the university. It's hard to argue, I think, that the tennis courts, as useful as they are for playing tennis, couldn't do more than just that. And I think everyone was quite relieved that there was a precedent established by the master plans which would allow a building to be built there that could be a more generous contribution to the campus and to the city. There were clearly some alignments, sight lines, setbacks and heights that we needed to work with in order to respect those important neighbours. And perhaps this diagram sums it up very well, where the Fisher Library has a very clear volume, a very notable building by a wonderful architect. And working between those two lines of trees on the northern and southern sides creates a certain volume that we knew we could work. We wanted to find a way of creating more useful space for people like the tennis courts, but not as a tennis court, that was very well connected to the campus and would invite people in, and also then be connected through to Victoria Park, because that is such a wonderful outlook and connection through the landscape. So how could you try and start to organise all the spaces that we knew the museum needed and wanted onto a very constrained footprint? So a lot of work was done trying to understand how you could join different parts of the brief together to be very efficient, and how you might start to stack those across the site to work. Lots of studies were done, and this is a pretty warts and all summary of the process that we were following through. Lots of people were exploring different ideas at the same time, and we would regularly meet to try and explore which were more successful than the others. A lot of models were made, again, to try and understand how could some of the very large volumes, like the temporary exhibition space, be organised in a way that made sense of a building form, but also a circulation system inside it that would work. So how, over many levels, dealing with the topography, which is quite steep, could you organise those levels to make sense that it felt comfortable? The last thing we wanted to do was to create a museum or a public building that felt like the moment you walked in the front door, most of what you were going to do was either disappear deep into a hole into the ground or have to walk up heaps of stairs to get somewhere. So finding that balance was quite critical. A lot of work went into understanding that sequence of spaces which would help meter out that arrival experience and your understanding of how the building is organised. A lot of modelling was continued, but we were starting to reach a point where we thought that this approach was not terribly successful. It was a little bit too complicated. And so we took a step back and reviewed the brief again and tried to take a different tack. And just for everyone's interest, this is a summary of the brief. And it is fairly similar to many other briefs for this type of building, where you might expect about a third of the building space to be exhibition space. This has relatively low back of house space, but it has other facilities around the campus. And then there are a series of programs that hang off those things. And then there's this notional idea that circulation, plant and amenities somehow get organised within this broader picture. So a lot of it was designed by spreadsheet to satisfy a range of stakeholders who clearly had to tick off those things that they needed to. But normally this would be a dreadful thing to say and quite disparaging, but it was good in the sense that it focused everyone's attention on what was important. And it made people think about how you could create spaces that had multiple purposes. So could a circulation space be at one time a usable space for an exhibition or an event or a dinner or something? So it really made people on all sides of the table try and negotiate to find the best outcome that we could get. We're also managing a different side. So on the left-hand side, you can see the combined side of that first scheme we looked at, which has a very large footprint and over 3 levels. And on the right-hand side, the footprint was really the same as the tennis courts that we were working to. A useful model that we were looking at is the Harvard Art Museums by Renzo Piano. Again, a multi-level building that's organised around a central court and has a series of spaces not dissimilar to these. A lot of studies were done then to try and understand how we could integrate the building into the landscape and create a sequence of spaces which made sense both from inside and outside as you navigated around. And we really, having gone through that very sort of circuitous loop, we arrived back close to where we'd started, but with a very different solution, which was there was a ground plane that was habitable with a series of spaces which stepped down across the topography, and there were a series of spaces contained in a volume that floated above that to create that openness and sense of access across the ground plane. So that was the model. It's incredibly crude, and looking at it now, I'm surprised we got it over the line. But everyone, perhaps they were just shocked, but it worked. We were able to explain how the thing worked. And so this was the start of the building that you're now in the sense that there is an arrival experience that relates to the Great Hall, but really gives you a sense of compression before it opens up to those fantastic vistas to the east. A multi-level building with a very clear circulation system that is centralised and has a daylit skylight on top of it, and a series of spaces then that connect out to the landscape around it. So very early drawing from quite a few years ago, which captures still the essence of what we were trying to do, that sense of walking in from the foyer space where you deal with all those conditioning things, cloaking and the like, and you step and you see all of a sudden down to the landscape right from that entrance experience. That's a great thing because all of a sudden you've got everything presented in front of you that helps you understand how you can then go and explore this building. One of the challenges of designing a building that has so many accessible public levels is that you don't want to end up with a dead end at the end of that experience. So having a central circulation system that had a series of galleries looped around it meant that you could create an experience where people could enjoy it on the way in and on the way out, which was very important. So this is probably the only plan in the presentation, but it gives you a sense of how compact the footprint is relative to the tennis courts. And that's why we were really forced to try and make the section work very hard. The height was defined by the Fisher Library. We didn't want to project up any higher than that. So it meant that more of the building had to be suppressed into the ground. That creates challenges then for how you get trucks and the like into the basement and the loading dock, but we were able to solve those. So this was the drawing that went in for the planning submission, and is very, very close to what you see today, largely because a lot of the work that was done to simplify and rationalise everything stood the test of time through the development. It's a bit of a gloomy image we never quite liked, but this again captured what we had really hoped to achieve right from the start. That was really the end of 2017, and all throughout 2018 we were documenting the project and working with a series of user groups. You can probably, well, maybe you can't, but I think this is user group number 12. So there's a very detailed series of consultation then with each of the individual user groups to, again, eke out those details of the brief which will make the building work for now and into the future. So enormous amount of effort, which is only visible through the way that people are now using the spaces, was evident. And an enormous amount of structural work to get the building to stand up. But it turned out that this was the most efficient way to achieve the objective that we set out to deal with. One of the things we always get asked is, how on earth do you create buildings like this that look so simple and effortless? The short answer is an enormous amount of work and a bit of yelling at people. And it takes a long time. And it's not just the design that does this, it's so many other people that are involved. Engineers, designers, builders, subcontractors. All these people make an enormous contribution, and we get to stand up as architects at the end and say, look how great we are. This building was an enormous effort from so many different people. What I thought I could do, because we get asked that question, is run through very, very quickly how this building was assembled, because I think it might take some of you by surprise. So in January 2018, it was a vacant site. Very quickly, a hoarding went up. There was a bit of disquiet about where the tennis courts had gone, but it kept going. By the middle of that year, there was a groundbreaking ceremony and the builder was on site. The piling had been completed and the excavation had started to be done. So there was an awful lot of dirt to dig out. And that kept going for several months. And you can get a sense from this image just how deep that basement was needing to go in order to contain all the spaces that were required to be below ground level. By October, most of that excavation was complete. And again, you can see with the guy with the high-vis orange vest just how big those perimeter walls are in order to create that space. Ramp coming down on the right-hand side and the lifts, pits just being constructed. But very quickly after that, the main structure started to move up. So by December and January, we're starting to get the first levels of the building inside. The ramp was being constructed. And by February, the first precast panels were arriving on site and almost immediately covered by the builder. And again, I must say that FDC, the builder engaged by the university, were excellent in the way they treated both the site and the building as something that would, in a sense, become part of the university's collection of artefacts. They were very respectful of the work and made sure that it was protected. Again, slabs coming up very, very quickly, ramp starts being closed. And by March, we're getting up to the ground level. So by March, we had a ground floor slab and you get a sense of the space. All the museums people were keen to visit, and David in particular and Paul were always on site having a look around. You can get a sense of the courtyard now coming together on the eastern side. More precast, which is part of a family of elements we might talk about a little bit later. And then by middle of that year, we're starting to get the concrete box coming up. Very large volumes, Marguerite giving the builder a bit of grief. An enormous amount of coordination to create this sort of environment was required. A lot of thinking through with the builder, a lot of prefabrication, a lot of prototyping. So again, credit to the university for pursuing this. We would always suggest it, but everyone was prepared to take the time and spend the money to do it, so that we all learned through that process. The concrete box was completed in 3 pours. So while all that was curing, effectively, there's an awful lot of propping to keep it up there. So this is actually the lobby space at the front. Very soon the building was closed up. Stairs and stuff are starting to arrive. So a lot of work went into framing up how the building hits the ground. So this is inside. This beam that runs along the side is how we engage the precast as it come down to the ground so that it looks natural against the landscape that comes up to it. This was also a disaster because you might all remember that was a period of extremely heavy rain, and that set the builder back quite some time. So that was really unfortunate. But once all that was depropped, I think everyone suddenly realised the sorts of potential this space had into the future. So it was great. By the end of last year, skylight was starting to be framed up, and included this just to give you a sense of how hard parts of the building are working. Because the height was compressed and because we couldn't put risers everywhere because there was so much pressure on area, walls are doing the distribution of services to try and take the pressure off usable spaces. So by February this year, the building outside was more or less complete. There was a lot of work going on inside, more spaces being created, the skylight coming up, landscape starting to be developed, building starting to be enclosed now, which meant more work could be developed. This room we're in now, again, starting to be framed up and created. And then by April, the roof was finished, everything was enclosed, but still a lot of work going on inside. Fit out of different types all throughout the building. So again, trying to manage multiple work faces by the builder was handled very, very well, I think. External spaces being created, while some were being finished, others are still really, really busy all through to the middle of the year. By July, the building was effectively practically complete, which meant that the fit out could start. So that's where we got to. For us though, I think it is the start of, and I purposely haven't included any images of the finished building because we don't have any yet that have the collections or the displays in them. And this is when we see the building coming to life. This is why we do these sorts of projects, because they're for the collections and for people to enjoy and connect with them. So that's really the sort of end point. We do need to mention Dr. Chau because his benefaction was a significant part in making this project happen. But I think it's more his aspiration for the potential of a place like this to create a safe space for all sorts of crazy ideas and interesting artifacts and thinking about culture can intersect. And what a better place to do it than at the front door of the university. I think it's absolutely marvellous. At the risk of running on a tiny bit, this is high risk, but we need to thank a lot of people. Every part of the university that we were involved with worked very, very hard. And I think all these groups were incredibly important. And I would like to single out Scott Biggs for his contribution because it was very, very important. We had a big team. This project was broken up into 2 parts. There was a design component. Then when the builder was selected, we were novated across. So some of those changed, but everyone joined in with the spirit of the project. And I think it's a credit to everyone, whether all the way through or just part of the project, they really made a big difference. We had a big team as well. And I think this picture here, we're up here talking to you, but it's these people were the engine that made it happen. So Supinder on the left-hand side was the project associate and did a marvellous job managing the team. Tim, Oliver, Marguerite and Isabel, these are the people who actually drew and designed and made possible the room you're in and the building you'll enjoy. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for giving us such a presentation and actually so much insight in the process, right down to the nitty-gritty and the details, and some of the models you made along the way and some of the difficult decisions you made along the way. I guess probably the first and one of the most burning questions for me is it's not that often that you get the opportunity to design a new museum building in this day and age. So what is it like to design and plan a museum for the 21st century?
Every museum is different. Every museum has a purpose, collection, it has different rooms. We were lucky that we had time to think quite strategically about what they thought this cultural infrastructure could do. And so it was up to us to look at what I think when we started, no one really had much conception of what the building would be. And I think the building we're in, is the outcome of a process. So I think we were a little bit taken aback when I think the suggestion was made that the project was all about the floating blocks. That was a consequence of the process, which we found very satisfying. Yes, we steered certain parts of that idea towards something that could work as a sensible container for a very particular type of space. But I think if we're able for people to understand that it was the process that Oh, sorry. How's that?
Yes, better. So that you mentioned the floating box concept, but you're saying that was not really a sort of leading concept, rather it was something that emerged along the way.
Yes, that's definitely true. Part of the inspiration for that, though, was that we knew we had a very large space that really didn't need any windows, the temporary exhibition space, which had to be put somewhere. And because those sorts of spaces can operate slightly differently to the more permanent collection or exhibition spaces, we did explore ways where we could elevate that up so it was an identifiable part of the building composition and well placed so that it was easily accessible. So that was the starting point, but then it evolved through discussion and design testing and the like to what we have now, where the box grew from a small part of the composition to something more generous, like, in a way, the character we have of those fig trees down the side of the site, the fact that they have such an enormous canopy that creates such a sheltered space. This part of the building does a similar thing.
Something I was interested to know more about as well, because you're not only working with an existing collection, you're also working with an existing beloved site, as it were. It's right here, the very central part of the campus. And as part of that, the building needs to talk to the quadrangle, the library, and also to the Gadigal land that it's built.
Yes.
So what kind of role did those challenges and opportunities play in your design process?
I'll let Kiong talk about the response to place and I think our thinking about sort of the longer term cultural connections that the project's made. But if I sort of touch on just the urban principles that define what we did, it was very much about respecting our important neighbours. The axial arrangement to the Great Hall was important. The height needed to respond to Fisher. The reason the entrance is located on this side is that it's better connected to University Place and feels like it's where a front door should be. We didn't want to have an arrival experience that almost avoided or subverted the fact you were on the campus. So by drawing people up through University Avenue to University Place and then coming into the building, it felt like you were embracing the fact this was a university and a university building, but a public building at the same time. Do you want to talk at all about the connection to country and our response to landscape?
I'm a young student on Monday. She gave a talk about how this place has been a meeting places for a very long time, even before this first sandstone building was built, and likely to be so for a long time to come. And I think for us, the idea is, you can't hear. Right. And working with the university or the museum, the idea of how we can use the landscape to communicate a first world or a indigenous understanding of place, and working through with Matt. Language is a window to a culture or another way of understanding, and by having the opportunity where we can introduce an understanding of their language, brings a better understanding of that worldview.
There's quite a prominent window, of course, overlooking the cityscape, as it were. And I wonder if you'd mind talking a little bit about the relationship between the building and the community, now that we've talked about the relationship between the building and the place and the university, how it connects itself to the broader community.
I think Sydney is very lucky that it has such a broad range of cultural institutions that work very well together. And I think certainly the way we understand from David Ellis and the team, how they see the outreach of this building working more broadly into the community, I think is really, really strong. What we've tried to do, I suppose, is just provide very flexible spaces that are comfortable for people to use, that can take on many different parts of life. So, for example, there are spaces outside which can support school groups. So when we're navigating through COVID times and managing people and circulation and more space, there are opportunities to use the building in a particular way. And when there are other requirements, we can start to use different parts of the building. So the fact that this is a public building, even though it's located on the university, I think because it's located where it is, it has great potential to be a connector for new communities and new interest groups and new ways of understanding other cultures. And because you only have to spend 5 minutes walking around here to see the diversity of collections, and the way that the curatorial team has created linkages between different parts of the exhibitions and the collections, it can't do anything but provoke you to think about different things, and that's what's so exciting. I think that yes, the building will I think be a very useful backdrop for that, but it is about making the place work for engagement with collections. So that's what we hope.
It's interesting, you see the collections are indeed so vital within that. And in a way, the diversity, the diversity of those collections has something for everybody.
Yes, I agree. You know, when you walk into the introductory space and see connections between artworks that haven't been on display for decades, yet are still incredibly powerful today and speak to issues that we're currently grappling with, that's the sort of power a museum like this has, and which I think will be of interest to all sorts of people.
I think that's something that's possibly a specific challenge of designing for museum spaces, which is that you have this requirement to find a balance between presentation and preservation.
Yes.
And I wonder what sort of considerations you need to take along into your process to ensure that you strike that balance.
There's perhaps two parts to that question. One is the spaces you create need to be flexible. Because the collections are so diverse, you need to find modules of space and connections that will suit a whole range of different types of display. And as technology changes, our expectations of what those sorts of spaces can do will change as well. The other is, I suppose, you want to find ways of connecting different spaces together. And that's why there are some galleries that have very clear vistas across different parts of the building, so you can link different themes across different parts of the building.
So you spoke earlier, Kiong, about that landscape relationship as well. You spoke earlier as well, Graeme, about the challenges of the site in general. I wonder, does that extend to sort of how you deal with the landscape around the site? So how you kind of make that, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble with the mic, that what you want to achieve in terms of giving that sense of place, that extends to the treatment of the landscape.
I think we see the museum or the building here as a series of, it's not a series of rooms, but it's a series of experiences that engages with the landscape and also with the collection. So yeah, and for us, it's also a sense of the connection between the inside and the outside, and the ability to also see the collection and have a sense of where you are, you know, of being here and of now. For us, that idea of blurring those boundaries are quite exciting. And I think when Graeme was talking earlier about how we organize the circulation of the movement, for us, we think a lot about movement, how we go through a museum, the sense of entry or arrival. And I think one of the reasons is we were looking for a way where we could separate the temporary exhibition from the permanent collection. And one of the ideas with the layers is maybe perhaps to seek an opportunity to push the temporary exhibition up one level. So the idea of ascending or up to that space. And then the idea of where the permanent collection is part of the knowledge, known, and part of the land, and a series of terraces and spaces that are dug into the landscape.
I wondered also, sort of out of personal curiosity, how influential is it? I can imagine you could do this in a building first led way or a collection first led way. So, the decision of what rooms house which collections, is that something that you sort of decide along the way as part of the process, or were there clear briefings at the beginning of, this needs to go there? And
that's a good question, and that answering it explains how really the process worked, where there was a very extensive and sometimes difficult, but always engaging discussion about what should drive what. So, and that comes back to the discussion about how flexible should you make spaces versus how bespoke should you make them for different types of collection. In the end, and I think David Ellis made the right decision, the museum errs on the side of flexibility over refinement to suit very particular things. Buildings like this should have a very, very long lifespan, and the way we use collections into the future, both as a community cultural resource and as an educational resource for the university, will change dramatically. So we need to try and find ways of making buildings like this as sustainable as they can be by just being very useful for a long time. So when you walk through the gallery spaces, most of the partitions or walls or display cabinets can all be removed. So they do become just very large, simple cavernous spaces if required, or they can be fitted out to suit particular things. So I'm sure over the next 5 to 10 years, if you were to come back in a decade's time, there would be many things that look quite different, but you would still have the same connection to outside. You would still have the same sense of arrival from outside, and that connection through the central space to the landscape beyond. So some things will endure, but others will change completely, I think, which is good.
In a way to that idea of the 21st century museum. So something like quality of flexibility is, something that can bring a museum forward into a very long lifespan.
Yes.
There were also some interesting examples from your presentation different kinds of exhibitions a museum may need to host. So I was wondering, alongside that idea of flexibility, do you think there's other key qualities a museum for the 21st century needs to have?
I think it needs to be responsive to audiences. So it needs to be able, again, to be adapted. So a different type of flexibility. And it needs, I think public buildings and our expectations of public buildings are changing. So we need to find ways to make sure that they feel more connected to their surroundings than they might otherwise do. Traditionally, some museums are very defensive in their approach and focused on presenting a very protective envelope. We've tried to do something slightly different here, which is be more open and permeable and connected to place so that it is actually more inviting for people.
I think
It's all right, I'll go over here.
I was going to say that the best museums condition the audience to be more receptive and be more open to what they see, the ideas, the exhibition, the collection, and you know, whether it's a museum of today or of the 21st century or of tomorrow. I think the very best ones are the ones that promote that.
On that note, is there a particular way you would hope that visitors would respond to this structure when they enter it for the first time?
I would hope that people feel like they want to come back and discover more, I think. The building, in large part, is about creating a focus of energy in this part of the campus that is centred on the exhibitions and the collections. But I hope that it becomes known and familiar for people as part of their everyday life. It shouldn't be so rarefied as to not feel like it's can be part of your sort of weekly cycle, whether you study at the university or live nearby, or the place should feel inviting enough to welcome people back, not just for the exhibitions, but for the place itself, and the ability to meet people should we get over the current circumstances.
So I guess it must have been one of the most satisfying things you could have seen today, to see all these people entering the building and enjoying it.
Absolutely. That is the purpose of architecture and our profession, to create places for people, and there's nothing better than seeing people enjoy them. Yeah.
So a bit more of maybe a bit more of a personal question now. I'm going to ask both Graeme and Kiong. Do you have any particular features that are your favourite?
Feature about the building. For me, it's just a sense of that connection and transparency and the link with the city and the connection with the outside, and the sense, as Graeme said, a place that's very welcoming. There's a sense of comfort or embracing that you can find shelter and be. For me, that's the feeling about the building that I find most appealing.
Almost something intangible. It's the atmosphere.
For me, we can't see it now, but the ability through many parts of the building to see the trees. I think that this is such a wonderful site, and the ability to connect what is normally a very enclosed building to the landscape is great.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about the materials that you chose to use in the construction and why these were chosen?
As everyone can see, it's principally a concrete building, or certainly the volume above us is. We knew we had to find something that was very robust, that was relatively straightforward to build, that was cost effective. For the concrete box, it's a very sensible solution because it combines facade and structure into one thing. So it's quite effective in that way. And it has a very strong visual presence, which I think is a positive thing. The sandstone coloured precast that people might have noticed, that was really an exploration of how you could create a series of landforms that would move down the landscape and create those sort of sheltered platforms that we like from headlands around Sydney Harbour. The sense that the landscape has evolved in such a way that it becomes useful in its own right. And we pursued that from a material sense because we had the confidence that with some of the contractors we'd worked with before, they could produce that sort of stuff. So it's not sandstone, but it is a contemporary expression of a masonry material that has some empathy with sandstone because it's coloured by real sand. It's not coloured by an oxide or something like that. So the material palette is really simple. But it's used in many ways to create a coherent experience of many different spaces. And then there's the overlay of the exhibition framework, which I think, again, adds a richness to the very simple, refined palette that we've used.
I'm also surprised, actually, walking around in here, how warm it feels. You know, you'd think a concrete building might tend towards sterile, but I think the choice of the interior finishes has also helped give it that really warm feeling.
I think that and the scale is important. None of the spaces other than the temporary exhibition space are so vast that they feel uncomfortable. So the combination of that material expression and the scale works well, I think.
So looking at the photos you were showing earlier of the sort of flooding rain and the concrete site being drilled down, this is, as you mentioned, quite a challenging site, and one of the challenges is how steep it is. I was wondering what was sort of the main issues you had to face in dealing with such a steep site.
Really all driven around circulation. So how can you connect in a way that doesn't feel like you have to walk too far down to other levels? So part of the design strategy there is to make use of that central space around which the stairs are organised, an ability to make a visual connection to other spaces, so you have a sense of where you're going to go and what's down there. That just makes people feel more comfortable, which is a good thing when you're exploring a place you haven't done before. The terraces on the outside make that possible. So there will be, I'm sure, over the next few years, a series of programs that start to use those external spaces more actively and connect things that are happening inside with outside. The site is so steep that it's not possible to get an accessible ramp down the side without a bit of gymnastics in the ground. So we were working very hard from the quadrangle side to get the levels right so that it felt comfortable arriving into the space, but equally from the other side, trying to get the loading dock to work, suitable for large trucks, having to ramp down very quickly. All those pressures were coming to bear on how you could organise a series of layers through the building.
I can imagine that lighting would also be something that you'd have to think about quite carefully.
Yeah, so all these lights are cast, well, there is an assembly made to cast them in. So yes, everything in the ceiling, in the wall, has been carefully thought through by someone, drawn, agreed, and then built. And yeah, there's an enormous amount of work gone into that. So doing anything simple takes a lot of work.
I think as we're sort of heading towards wrapping up, I've got one last question I'd like to ask, which is, I guess, in terms of JPW as an organisation, where do you see the Chau Chak Wing Museum fitting into your concepts of what a cultural space should be, and what the architecture of a cultural space should be?
I think this project, the Chau Chak Wing Museum, has brought all the experience that we've gained from our other projects and given us the opportunity to try and coalesce that into one building. I'm sure the next building we do of this type will be different, but it will learn from this building. I think the most satisfying thing is that it feels very comfortable here, and the building will be part of the university landscape for a long, long time. I think, yeah, that's what we hope will happen.
That must be a really satisfying thing to leave such a great legacy as well on a site like this. I'll hand back over to Craig to wrap up this evening's session.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, and for those watching online too, apologies for a few technical difficulties with microphones, but thank you for the three of you for persevering. We do appreciate it. Before I wrap up, just an invitation to our guests to join us next Thursday night for the Macleay Collection's annual Being Collected lecture, where we examine the relationship between Indigenous art and the history of collecting within cultural institutions in Australia. But otherwise tonight, a big, big thank you to Madeleine for holding it all together. And thank you so much, Graeme and Kiong, for taking us on the journey through the adventure that is the building that we now stand in. So thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Everyone suddenly realised the sorts of potential this space